Before the lawsuit, before the headlines, before the internet began pulling apart every public word, every old interview, every carefully built idea of who he was, Justin Baldoni had already become something unusually powerful in Hollywood. Not just a man with a career, a man with a message. And that is always more dangerous, because actors can survive bad roles, directors can survive flops. But when a public figure becomes attached to morality, to kindness, sensitivity, healing, emotional intelligence, the stakes change. The audience is no longer simply watching what he makes. It is watching whether he is the man he says he is. And for Justin Baldoni, that question would eventually become the entire story. But first, there was the rise. He did not arrive in Hollywood as an obvious giant. He built recognition step by step, moving through early television work before breaking through in Jane the Virgin, where he played Raphael Solano. That role mattered because it gave him visibility, but visibility alone was never what made him distinct. Plenty of actors become recognizable. Baldoni became something more curated than that. He started to stand out not only as a performer, but as a man who wanted to speak about vulnerability in a way Hollywood men often avoid. He was not selling arrogance, he was selling reflection, not dominance, but emotional openness. That image made him feel different, and difference, when marketed well, becomes identity. Over time, Baldoni moved beyond acting into directing and producing, with projects like 5 Feet Apart and Clouds, stories that leaned into emotional intensity, mortality, love, pain, and human fragility. Even that pattern mattered. His work began to mirror the public identity forming around him, a man interested in feeling, not just spectacle. A man who seemed more comfortable discussing grief, tenderness, and personal struggle than performing the usual masculine armor expected in celebrity culture. Then came Man Enough, and that was when the image hardened into something much bigger than fame. With the Man Enough platform, Baldoni positioned himself at the center of conversations about masculinity, shame, vulnerability, and what it means to be a better man in a culture that often rewards the opposite. The branding was powerful because it felt sincere. He wrote, spoke, hosted, and presented himself as someone trying to challenge harmful definitions of manhood. For a lot of people, that was compelling. He did not just look like a decent man, he sounded like one. He made language itself part of the image. That is what made him so compelling to believe in, and belief is where the danger starts. Because once the public decides someone represents emotional safety, it does not respond to him like a normal celebrity anymore. It invests, it projects, it gives him moral credit in advance. Baldoni's appeal was never only about talent or looks, it was about trust. He seemed like the kind of man modern audiences wanted to exist. Self-aware, thoughtful, feminist-adjacent, willing to question masculinity without surrendering his place inside it. In an industry full of men trying to look powerful, he built power by looking gentle. That kind of image is incredibly effective. It is also incredibly fragile, because the more a man is admired for being emotionally evolved, the less room he has for contradiction. The more he is celebrated for language about healing and respect, the more devastating it becomes if the reality around him starts to feel messier than the message. And long before the legal war exploded into public view, that was already the hidden tension inside Justin Baldoni's rise. He was not just building a career, he was building a moral brand. And moral brands do not break the way normal celebrity images break. They break harder. Because when the public stops trusting a performer, it loses interest. But when it stops trusting a man who built his fame partly on being trustworthy, it starts asking a much darker question. Was any of it real? Background for this part includes Baldoni's rise through Jane the Virgin, his directing work on 5 Feet Apart and Clouds, his Man Enough platform and book, and the ongoing legal case tied to It Ends With Us. The problem with a moral brand is that it does not collapse all at once. First, the air changes. That is how it began for Justin Baldoni. Not with a verdict, not with a clean public turning point, but with atmosphere. With the subtle shift that happens when a project stops looking like a success story and starts feeling like something unstable behind the scenes. And it ends. With Us was always the kind of project that could not afford instability. The material itself was too charged, too emotional, too exposed to public judgment. A story about love, pain, power, and abuse was never going to be treated like ordinary entertainment. It was already carrying a moral weight before the cameras even rolled. That made Baldoni's position inside it more dangerous than it looked. Because by then, he was not simply an actor or director attached to a high-profile adaptation. He was a man whose public identity had been built around emotional intelligence, empathy, and a language of care. So the second tension began to gather around the project. People were not only watching the production, they were watching him. Watching whether the man who had built a reputation on sensitivity could survive a film surrounded by whispers, strain, and increasingly visible discomfort. That is when the image started to feel vulnerable. At first, it was not about facts the public could hold cleanly in its hands. It was about tone, distance. The kind of silence that makes people suspicious. The kind of promotional atmosphere that feels colder than it should. Audiences are very good at sensing when something is wrong long before they understand what it is. And once they sense it, they begin doing what the internet always does. Filling in the empty spaces with theory, instinct, and appetite. That is when a celebrity stops controlling his own narrative. Because ambiguity is not neutral online. Ambiguity invites aggression. In Baldoni's case, that ambiguity hit at the exact worst point possible. If he had been known as reckless, arrogant, or openly combative, the public might have processed the tension around the film in a simpler way. But he was not selling that kind of masculinity. He had spent years presenting a softer language, a more thoughtful one. Which meant the moment unease entered the story, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The gap between the image and the atmosphere became the real headline. And gaps like that do not stay quiet for long. What made this stage so dramatic was not that the scandal had fully arrived. It hadn't. Not yet. What made it dramatic was the feeling that something underneath the surface was starting to rot. The project that should have strengthened Baldoni's public image began to threaten it instead. The film was supposed to be proof that he could carry emotionally serious material into the mainstream. Instead, it became the setting where people first started asking whether the persona he had built could survive real pressure. That is the moment a public image becomes fragile. Not when people hate you, not even when they accuse you, but when they begin doubting the emotional truth of what you represent. And for Justin Baldoni, that doubt was already spreading before the legal war ever fully exploded. Because once a good man starts to feel difficult to read, the public does not get calmer. It gets hungry. The explosion came the moment ambiguity turned into paperwork. Because rumors can still be managed, tension can still be denied, silence can still be dressed up as professionalism. But once accusations enter court filings, the mood changes instantly. The story is no longer about whether something feels wrong. It becomes a battle over who is lying, who is shaping the narrative, and who the public is willing to believe. That was the point where Justin Baldoni's image stopped looking vulnerable and started looking endangered. When the conflict around It Ends With Us escalated into a legal war with Blake Lively, the internet did what it always does with celebrity conflict. It split, then sharpened. Suddenly, every interview, every clip, every quote about empathy and masculinity was dragged back into the light and examined under a harsher lens. Baldoni was no longer just being watched as a director or actor. He was being judged as a man whose public identity had promised emotional safety. And that is why this chapter hits so hard. Because ordinary celebrity scandals damage reputation, But scandals like this attack coherence. They force the public to ask whether the message ever matched the man. Baldoni had spent years speaking the language of vulnerability and masculinity. So the moment allegations, denials, counterclaims, and legal strategy took over the conversation, the emotional stakes became much bigger than the case itself. This was no longer only about one film. It was about whether the moral architecture of his image could survive conflict. That is the kind of pressure a brand like his is least equipped to absorb. The public can forgive a man for being messy. It can even forgive arrogance if arrogance was always part of the package. What it struggles to forgive is dissonance. And Baldoni's problem was not just that he was accused. It was that the accusations collided head-on with the values he had used to define himself. The softer the image, the more brutal the suspicion. The more trustworthy the brand, the more intense the backlash when trust begins to wobble. That is what made the legal war feel so global, so impossible to ignore. People were no longer only choosing sides in a Hollywood dispute. They were choosing which version of morality they wanted to believe. Was Baldoni a man being publicly destroyed by a narrative he insisted was false? Or was he a man whose public language had always been more polished than real? Once those questions take hold, facts alone do not calm the audience. By then, people are no longer just following a case. They are defending a worldview. And that may be the most dangerous stage of all, because once a celebrity becomes the battleground for larger arguments about gender, power, performance, and truth, the scandal stops belonging only to the people inside it. Every update becomes ammunition. Every silence becomes strategy. Every legal move gets read like confession. And for Justin Baldoni, that was the moment the image stopped cracking quietly. It began breaking in public. What makes Justin Baldoni's story so compelling is not that the image cracked. It is that the crack happened in the exact place where the image had always looked strongest. For years, he was not just another man in Hollywood trying to seem thoughtful. He built an identity around being the exception, the sensitive one, the self-aware one, the man willing to talk about shame, vulnerability, masculinity, and emotional responsibility in a culture that usually rewards the opposite. That was the promise, and promises like that do not collapse quietly. They echo. By the time the legal war turned him into a global argument, the public was no longer just reacting to one dispute. It was reacting to the possibility that a man so closely associated with emotional safety could become impossible to read. And maybe that is what made the story feel bigger than scandal. It was not only about blame, it was about disorientation. The audience did not just feel angry or divided, it felt uncertain. And uncertainty is poison for a moral brand. Because once people stop trusting the feeling you built around yourself, every old word changes shape. The interviews sound different, the message sounds different. Even the kindness starts to look strategic. That is the hardest part of a fall like this. It is not simply reputational damage. It is reinterpretation. The public goes back and replays everything through a darker lens, asking whether sincerity was ever sincerity or just performance packaged well enough to feel real. And for someone like Baldoni, that question is more dangerous than a temporary backlash. Because careers recover from controversy, but moral identities recover much more slowly. That is why this ending cannot be written like a clean victory or a clean destruction. It is neither. Even if the legal battle shifts, even if some claims fall away, even if public opinion moves again, something more permanent has already happened. The image has been separated from certainty, and once that happens, the old version never fully returns. So this is not really the story of a good man revealed or a bad man exposed. It is the story of what happens when a man builds power through trust, and then becomes trapped inside the question of whether that trust was ever deserved. Maybe that is the real ending, not the lawsuit. Not the headlines, not even the verdicts. but the fact that Justin Baldoni is now harder to believe in than he used to be. And for a man whose public image depended so much on belief, that may be the deepest fracture of all.